Pastor Zeth was profoundly concerned for my well-being when it comes to me addressing this particular topic. Actually, no, not so much concerned for my well-being as I think inside saying, better you than me. But anyways, as we continue on with our focus on marriage and then considering covenant faithfulness when it comes to the wife's role, we know that there are a number of times that Scripture speaks to this. And so we see, typically we look into Ephesians chapter 5, where it says, wives, to your own husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife as Christ is the head of the church. And so we read this. We know that it says in Colossians chapter 3, verse 21, it says, again, wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as to the Lord. We know that it says in 1 Peter chapter 3, it talks verses 1 through 6, it talks about responding with a right heart and a right spirit toward your husband. And that one's an interesting one because that is actually set within the context of a relationship between a wife who is a believer and a husband who is a non-believer. And so there are these pictures that are provided for us at different places about how a wife carries out her role, her obedience to the commands of God when it comes to the design for marriage. And we started this, or we have taken some time, we've been taking some time looking at the creation design originally. And as we look at that creation design, God's good gift, as he gave it, we took time in Genesis chapter 2, which I always think is an incredibly beautiful picture there, where we see Adam, first of all, as Eve comes to him, declaring his at last. At last, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. And I think of the beauty of that scenario as he takes a look and sees this one who is going to be part of him. And then we talked, as we took a look in Genesis 2, we looked at how then, out of that original creation act, the Spirit of God prompted Moses to write about the nature of the characteristics of marriage. And remind me again, there were three characteristics that were set out for us as we took a look in Genesis chapter 2, specifically verses 24. We were given three things. And what were the three things that we were given there? What were the three characteristics? Marriage is to be, primary priority relationship. Marriage is to be, permanent. Yeah. Primary priority relationship, permanent relationship. Marriage is to be, deeply intimate. Okay, so it is supposed to be the deepest and most intimate of human relationships. So we have this picture, primary priority relationship. We have this picture of permanent relationship. We have this picture of the deepest of intimacies. And as we take a look at marriage in its pre-fall state, out of this, with these three characteristics, the very next thing we're told is that they were both naked and they were not ashamed. And we talked about the fact that that meant that marriage as it should be means that two people can be entirely vulnerable with each other and trust that the person that they are in relationship with will have their well-being at heart. So there should be this in a marriage that is as God designed it, there should be this strong sense of the fact that we can be vulnerable, we can be naked before each other, and we can trust that other person because they are entirely committed to us. And this is the picture that we have. And then, as we follow through the flow of the passage, the crazy thing, of course, in the English we have chapter divides, we have verse divides. In the original, they're not there. And right after, we're told that they can trust each other entirely, that they can be vulnerable with each other, that they can be entirely open and connected together. What's the next thing that we read? Now the serpent. And that's to me, one of the really, really amazing and interesting and profound things about this passage as we take a look at and as we think about marriage today. That the very next statement that we read is, "Now the serpent was more crafty than any other beast of the field that the Lord God had made." And we follow through and we see Eve's interaction with the serpent. And as we see Eve's interaction with the serpent, then what we see is something that is very, very, I would say, diagnostic. When I say diagnostic, I mean diagnostic even of part of what the problem is in our marriages. Because there's something that goes on between Eve and the serpent. How does this play out? Well, what we see is that the first response that Eve makes to the serpent, or what the serpent appeals to or attempts to build in her, is he begins with the mistrust of God. So that's how he goes at her. Did God actually say, "You shall not eat of any tree in the garden"? And the woman said to the serpent, "We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God said, 'You shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it, lest you die.' But the serpent said to the woman, 'You will not surely die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil.'" God's a liar. You can't trust him. He's just trying to keep you from what's really good. And that's an interesting point to begin with when it comes to Eve, because this is really, when you stop and you think about it, this is the essence. This is the essence of what our faith battle, our faith struggle is. Do we really believe that God not only exists, but that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him? That's what Hebrews 11 tells us the definition of faith is. Without faith, it says in Hebrews 11 verse 6, it is impossible to please God, because he who comes to God must believe that he is, that he exists, and that he is the rewarder of those who diligently seek him. In other words, God's reward as we follow him is greater than whatever reward we might gain for ourselves by our own means going in our own direction. That's an interesting thing. So here he is. What he does right at the beginning is he strikes at Eve's trust. Now think about this. This is the Creator who to this point has made them, has given them everything, has put them in this beautiful garden, has given them each other, and has only, to this point, walked in intimate communion with them. That has been the nature of their relationship. Made, provided everything, walked in intimate communion, put them in a beautiful garden, and Eve decides, he doesn't want my best. That's what she decides of God. He doesn't want my best. I'm the one who wants my best, and I know better, and I will control what the best is, and I will call the shots. Now we look at that tree put in the middle of the garden, and I think what we understand in that tree is that Eve has been given one boundary only. And she's been given that boundary to give her a venue to actually exercise trust, which is so essential to a deep, meaningful relationship. If you're going to have a deep, meaningful relationship, there has to be trust. So she's been given one boundary, one venue to actually exercise trust, and we know how it plays out. And we call the result of this the curse. Because God says, "Cursed are you," to each of the parties involved in the story. But we could also think of the relational aspect of it as the consequence. It's the consequence of mistrust unleashed. I want you to look with me at Genesis chapter 3, verse 16. To the woman he said, I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be contrary to your husband, but he shall rule over you. Now that's an interesting phrase that we see at the latter half of the verse as it describes the curse or the consequence effects of the first act of mistrust. I've explained before what the Hebrew language in this verse reflects, and some translations are ambiguous. So, for instance, in some translations, you'll read, your desire shall be for your husband. But the ESV is really good here, because what it does is it reflects the intent of these words incredibly clearly. It doesn't say in an ambiguous way, your desire will be for your husband, and the question out of that has been, oh, then you're really going to love him deeply, but he's not going to love you back. Instead, it exercises this statement, your desire shall be, or it makes this statement, your desire shall be contrary to your husband, but he shall rule over you. And there is good reason to actually take the ambiguity out of those words and to understand that this is exactly what's being said. We see the exact same Hebrew phrase in Genesis chapter 4, verse 7, when God warns Cain about his relationship to sin. Genesis chapter 4, verse 7, exact same Hebrew words are used, and it says this, as God talks to Cain, who's on the edge of acting murderous. If you do well, will you not be accepted? If you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. In other words, again, ESV, its desire is contrary to you. It wants to control you, but you must master it. And so we see this Hebrew construction and the clue to the intent of the words that are said to Eve as the consequence is clearly laid out for us as we come back to Genesis chapter 3. God's use in Genesis 4 verse 7 removes all ambiguity from our understanding here. Eve mistrusts God's commitment to her well-being. And as a consequence, she will also mistrust her husband's commitment to her well-being. She will determine to be the boss. She will determine to take charge. She will determine to be the one who bends her husband to her will once again. And this is her active sin. Her active sin is that she will determine to be the one who bends her husband to her will, as she did when she gave him the fruit. And so we look at this, and as we think about this, we then see this. We see the other consequence of her mistrust of God. Her other consequence is this. In her mistrust of her husband, too often she's going to be right. Take a look at this. Your desire will be contrary to your husband, but he shall rule over, he shall dominate you. Those words are not intended to be a positive statement regarding the husband. Those words are not intended to be, this is what the husband's role should be. Those words, too, are the curse. So, the curse is that Eve will want to bend her husband to her will, and her husband ruthlessly will dominate her in far too many cases. And this is exactly what we have seen through history. We call it the battle of the sexes. And as we watch the battle of the sexes, it is a curse, and the man is acting in a cursed fashion when he dominates his wife. This is not a statement of this is what the man's role is supposed to be. So, let's recap. In her mistrust of her husband, in her mistrust of his leadership, too often she is going to be absolutely right to have mistrusted him because he's going to be untrustworthy. He's going to be dominant, and he is not going to be benevolent in his intention. This is not a positive. It's the curse. So you've mistrusted God, who has been nothing but benevolent to you, who has done everything for your good. In turn, you will mistrust your husband, and he will actually, in a lot of cases, end up being just as bad as you are acting like he's going to be. That's the curse. Okay, questions before we move on? I want to make sure that I've explained this clearly for people so that I haven't left in, because I think that sometimes what happens is people take a look at the curse and they see it as command in some sense. Well, this is how the marriage is supposed to be. That's not, this is how the marriage is supposed to be. It is, this is how badly the marriage has become broken. Okay, questions? Thoughts? Okay, so let's move on then. Yes? Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, yeah. You know what? That's probably, your question is probably the great question of the ages, of every single person. Yeah, yeah. It's at the base of what we call theodicy. What would make a person who has been given everything by a loving God, what would make them then do something that was entirely destructive of that? Yeah. Yeah. How do you get to that? Yeah, exactly. So what happens is usually when people really try and wrestle with this and understand it, what they have come to, what different ones have come to in the course of discussion is that they've said that in some sense this falling is rooted in the finiteness of the beings. You know, as compared to an infinite being, perfect but finite, and whether that's the whole thing or not, I don't know. Because really, what you're asking in a lot of ways is kind of a psychological, moral question, right? Yes. Not that they, by finite, I don't mean that they weren't beings who were separate from death, because they were not going to die. But when we say finite, we mean just in the very fact that they were not omnipresent, omnipotent, omniscient, the whole thing. They were finite, even though they were morally unstained at this point. Yeah. Yes, John. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Well, and this is what we believe when we think about the fact that whom he sanctified, he glorified. As we take a look at Romans chapter 8 and we follow what's sometimes called the golden chain, the final link in the golden chain is that God is going to make us something entirely new that holds us. Yeah. So here we are. We see all of this, and as we watch, the result is two people locked in a battle for control, and that continues today. And after we see this mistrust, and then out of this mistrust, the mistrust being the consequence of the curse, and the thought that I need to dominate, I need to exercise leadership, and then with that mistrust, actually, mistrust being kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And guess what? Because you have refused that leadership, you are going to experience the worst version of it that you could imagine. This is what's going to come out of this. As we see how this works, how does this manifest next for wives? And I would say that as we diagnose and try and understand what's going on, one of the big things we face inside of marriage is the thought that the command to a wife to respect is actually conditional. The command to a wife to respect is conditional as compared to being unconditional. Now, I want to stop and I want to step back to, Zeth was talking about the husband's responsibility in covenant marriage and what the husband is called to. And we know this. We know that the worst of a husband comes when he doesn't understand that his leadership must be characterized unconditionally by sacrifice, by servanthood, by nurturing, by treasuring, by love. That's the worst of husbanding. When a husband does not, I shouldn't just say understand, does not believe, is not committed to leadership that is characterized unconditionally by sacrifice, by servanthood, by nourishing, by treasuring, by love. We have a clear picture as to what a husband's leadership is to be when we take a look at the Ephesians chapter 5 pattern. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself for it, that he might sanctify and cleanse it by the washing of the water of the word, and present to himself a spotless bride, not having any blemish or wrinkle. And in the same way, husbands, you must nourish and cherish your wives as your own body. And so we have this picture where the husband, if he understands the nature of his leadership, he puts his wife ahead of himself. Now, that's a strange way for us to think about leadership, because we tend to think about leadership as bossing. But this is leadership that says, I am going to sacrifice. I want to put her ahead of me. And Christ loved, and Christ gave his life, and in the same way the husband is to love like his own body. He's to nourish, he's to nurture, he's to cherish, he's to treat as the highest treasure. So we understand all this. So when we teach husbands, love your wives, we know and teach that this is unconditional. And everybody says, yeah, this is unconditional. Yeah. It doesn't depend on whether she's really pretty and beautiful and wonderful and doing everything she should. It doesn't depend on that. It's unconditional. Because the husband, at his most Christ-like, loves his wife when she's at her ugliest and least lovely and very worst. I know it's almost dangerous for me to imply that such moments could exist. But I am convinced that our ladies here are truthful enough in themselves that they know that of themselves. And so when I talk to my wife, when I tell her just how wonderful I think she has said to me on more than one occasion, if you knew what my heart was like. You know? And she's truthful about it. She recognizes that. And I think that probably any of us who is truthful about it recognizes that of ourselves. But here we are, the husband at his most Christ-like loves his wife when she's at her least lovely, when she's at her very worst. We have actually a bit of an Old Testament foreshadowing of this when the prophet Hosea sees his marriage disaster become an object lesson. And maybe you remember Hosea the prophet and what happened with him. But God is going to show his rebellious, unfaithful, horrifically sinful people, his bride, Israel. He is going to show them what unconditional love is. And so what ends up happening is he sees Hosea, whose heart is being ripped from his chest, as his wife plays the prostitute, as she goes off to various men who are going to give her the stuff that she wants, money-wise and treasure-wise and everything else. He sees Hosea as his wife moves from one unfaithfulness to another, and God calls Hosea to pursue her and love her and draw her back, because that's who he, God, is toward his unfaithful bride. And we look at that and we think, that is an amazing picture. Because that is a picture of who Christ is. And that is a picture of who the Father is in his relationship to his people. And we recognize that the husband's call to unconditional love is not dependent on the wife's fulfillment of the covenant. And when we say love, I'm not talking about a romantic feeling. We're talking about love in its full orb description as we see it, for instance, in 1 Corinthians 13. A husband is called to love patiently, kindly. Love is patient, it's kind, it does not boast, it is not proud, it is not rude, it is not self-seeking, it is not easily angered, it keeps no record of wrongs, it does not delight in evil, it rejoices with the truth, it always protects, it always provides, it always hopes, it always perseveres. Love never fails. That's the picture that we're given of love. And as we're given that picture of love, that's what a husband is called to. It's not dependent on the wife's fulfillment of the covenant. We know that ultimately she might take actions that entirely break the covenant. But the husband's commitment to the promises of the covenant is not based in his wife's performance or his feelings about her performance. He has declared to God and to her that he will love her, and we understand that this command is unconditional. We recognize that biblical love is more than a feeling. We lost that loving feeling, may be the basis for a pop song, but it's not the basis for biblical love. It's not our understanding of biblical love. In Christian circles, if those who claim to be Christian are Christian in their view of the scriptures, they accept this. The Bible is authoritative, and its command to the husband is unconditional. But for some, at least, in Christian circles, there is a tendency to understand the biblical instruction to the wife to respect and to honor as conditional, as depending on how well he's doing. Isn't that interesting? That we would say that the husband absolutely is called to unconditional love, but that the wife can base her obedience to the command of God on her husband's performance. If he doesn't perform well enough, I don't need to respect him. I'll respect him if he acts in a way that I deem worthy of respect. I don't respect him because he has failed to act in a way worthy of respect. Now, the first reaction of many in the culture would be, as they listen to the direction that I'm going in, as they think about where I'm going in, to think, oh, so you're going to teach some sort of doormat theology. Marriage as a doormat. And if this is a particularly sensitive matter for you, please don't jump to that conclusion, at least until you've heard me out. Come back next week, okay? As you come back next week, I believe that I can make a very, very solid case for this, and I am absolutely convinced, As I told you, the CBC anecdote from last week of that round table of women, all of whom said they had never seen a happy marriage in their lives. I am convinced that there is a reason why we have more women in our church who actually like their husbands. And I believe that it's because at least a portion of the women in our church look at and say, I'm serious about the commands of God. And I'm serious about following those commands unconditionally, even if he doesn't always measure up. So anyways, we're going to continue on. We're going to look at this. And sorry if I took a fair bit of time to kind of go back over other material, but I think it's a really good thing for us to understand, hey, you know what? We expect that if the marriage is going to function according to God's design, the husband has to take the command of God seriously. But I will tell you that at least in some circles, there are people who say that they're Christian who don't think that the wife should take that command seriously. And that's come very, very, I won't take much time on it, but that's become very, very clear to me because I buy this book by the caseload that's called Love and Respect, and I use it inside of marriage and pre-marriage counseling, and it's very, very interesting because there are two responses to that book. And if you go on to Amazon reviews or anything like that, you will see two responses. You will see women who give it 5 stars and glowingly say, this saved and transformed my marriage. And then you will see women who will give it 1 star and say, it's the worst and most terrible piece of dreck you can possibly imagine. And it's very interesting because there's no middle ground. It's like, how misogynistic, how horrible can you possibly be to say that respect is unconditional? Or, I actually grasp this, and it has made our marriage beautiful. And it's a fascinating thing to me to see that massive divide. I didn't realize it until my daughter phoned me one day and she was talking to me on the phone and she said, Dad, do you know how much a lot of Christian women hate the book Love and Respect? And it caught me off guard and I thought, really? And then I ended up having a follow-up conversation with Marcy, and Marcy said, oh yeah, you would not believe the chat rooms that I see. You would not believe how much a lot of Christian women despise being told that respect is to be unconditional, just like love is unconditional. And that was a fascinating piece of information to me. And that probably explains to a great degree why right now the church has the same divorce rate almost. It's below, fortunately, but the church's divorce rate is closer to the world's divorce rate. And one of the interesting things about that, when I say the church's divorce rate is close to the world's divorce rate, is that when they dug deeper in that they found that most of those who would claim to be Christian who have moved to that divorce rate are people who actually don't go to church but identify as born-again believers. In other words, don't actually follow through on obedience to the commands of God. So, anyways, let's pray. Father, thank you for allowing us to take some time and to think together, and I pray as we continue on in this that you would be at work in our marriages, that our marriages would reflect the beauty of your design, and with that, the joy that comes out of that design. And I pray that we would think this through seriously and well, and that we would think this through recognizing that your intent for us is always